The galaxy didn't announce the sanctions like a declaration of war. It delivered them like a judgment already finalized. Across Earth's skies, the first sign was not noise, it was absence. Orbital traffic control systems blinked once, then went silent. Communication relays that once stitched humanity into the wider cosmos began returning empty handshakes from deep space, as if the universe itself had politely stopped acknowledging Earth's existence. Then came the message. It appeared everywhere at once, not as a transmission from any identifiable origin point, but as a synchronized imposition across every network connected to interstellar exchange. Government archives, corporate databanks, civilian interfaces, no system was spared. Even isolated offline terminals flickered alive long enough to display the same verdict before shutting down again. Galactic economic sanctions initiated. No warships crossed the boundary of human space. No alien armadas descended upon the atmosphere. There was no need. The galaxy had learned something more efficient than destruction. It had learned removal. At first, the language seemed bureaucratic, almost sterile enough to be mistaken for routine policy adjustment. Trade embargoes, resource restrictions, technology access revocation, communication limitations. Each clause stacked neatly upon the last, forming a structure of controlled isolation so precise it felt engineered rather than declared. But beneath the legal architecture, the true intent was unmistakable. Earth was being cut out, not conquered, not destroyed, just made unnecessary. In the high-orbit monitoring stations, human analysts watched as interstellar nodes began rejecting Earth-originating requests. Automated systems that had once processed human data without hesitation now responded with silent denial loops. Stargates that had opened freely for centuries now refused alignment calibration. Even passive astronomical feeds, once shared as neutral scientific exchange, began filtering Earth-based access as if the planet itself had been reclassified. Inside the Eurasian diplomatic continuity vault, the atmosphere felt heavier with every passing second, not because of physical change but because of realization, the kind that settles in slowly like gravity discovering it has a new target. Director Cale Arden stood beneath the rotating holographic lattice of galactic treaties, each one dissolving in real time as clauses were overridden by sanction protocols. The light from collapsing agreements painted his face in shifting blues and reds, like a world dying in slow motion across his eyes. Around him, silence deepened. Not confusion, not panic, something worse, understanding. A junior analyst finally spoke, voice barely steady. "They're not attacking us." No one responded immediately. The statement felt incomplete, as if words themselves had become inadequate. Cale's eyes remained fixed on the galactic map as entire trade routes faded from existence. Star systems once dependent on human exchange now rerouted automatically, bypassing Earth as if it had never been part of the equation. "They're deleting us from participation," the analyst finished. Outside the vault, Earth still turned. Oceans still moved. Cities still breathed with the rhythm of human life. But something fundamental had shifted above them, an invisible severing from the larger structure they had spent centuries reaching toward. And in that severance, a terrifying truth began to form. The galaxy did not need to destroy humanity to defeat it. It only needed to stop including it. Earth had not always been on the outside. There was a time, barely a century ago, when humanity stood at the threshold of the galaxy like a child pressing its face against a vast illuminated window. The first contact had been celebrated as salvation. Trade routes meant prosperity. Technology exchange meant survival. Membership in the galactic network meant future. Now that same network hovered above Earth like a closing eye. The planet had changed since those early days, but not in the way the galaxy once predicted. It did not become dependent. It did not fracture under cultural pressure or economic integration. Instead, it adapted, quietly, methodically, and with an unsettling patience that even alien economists struggled to model. On the surface, Earth looked unchanged. Oceans rolling under shifting cloud systems, continents lit by dense constellations of city light, orbital elevators stretching like luminous threads between ground and void. But beneath that familiar image, the real architecture of humanity had evolved into something far more layered. Entire industries now operated in dual states. Visible economies that interacted with galactic markets and hidden terrestrial networks that no external system had ever fully mapped. Energy grids that could reroute planetary output in seconds. communication systems that did not rely on interstellar relays at all, manufacturing chains that could isolate themselves from foreign supply dependencies without collapsing internal stability. Humanity had learned something uncomfortable during its rise among the stars. Access is vulnerability. And so they built redundancy into everything. Deep beneath the Eurasian Diplomatic Continuity Vault, where Earth's highest-level interstellar negotiations were monitored, Director Cale Arden walked through corridors that hummed with layered computational silence. Every step echoed against polished alloy floors designed to suppress vibration, as if even sound was considered too revealing. Above him, holographic treaty networks expanded and collapsed in constant flux. Millions of agreements with alien civilizations rendered as floating geometric structures of light. Trade accords with the Veil Consortium, resource exchanges with the Threx Dominion, cultural integration protocols with species whose languages were still partially unresolved by Earth linguistics. It all looked stable. It all looked permanent. But Cale knew better. Because nothing in the galaxy was permanent. It was only currently allowed. A technician beside him adjusted a floating interface, brows tightening as new data cascaded across their display. "They're increasing audit frequency," she said quietly. Cale didn't stop walking. "Whose systems?" "All of them," she replied. "Multiple factions. Independently initiated, but synchronized in timing." That word lingered. Synchronized. It always meant coordination, and coordination at this scale meant intent. They reached the central observation chamber, where the full galactic trade lattice rotated slowly above a circular command platform. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost dangerous, like watching a web so intricate you forgot it was designed to catch something. Cale looked up at it. Somewhere in that lattice, Earth was just another node, another participant, another compliant world among thousands. But participation is not the same as control. A subtle shift rippled through the holographic structure. One node flickered, then another. Not failure, revision. As if the system itself was quietly reevaluating Earth's status without announcing the decision. Cale's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A stillness. The kind that arrives when a person realizes they are being watched not by individuals, but by systems that no longer need permission to judge. Behind him, the technician whispered, almost unwilling to give the thought sound. "Sir, why would they all look at us at the same time?" Cale's eyes remained on the collapsing patterns of light above them. "Because," he said softly, "something about us just became inconvenient." And far above Earth, in the cold architecture of interstellar governance, the galaxy quietly began to decide what inconvenience should become next. The conflict did not begin with weapons being drawn. It began with systems quietly refusing to agree on what Earth was allowed to be. At first, the pressure felt administrative, cold, procedural, almost polite. Trade requests from Earth began returning with delayed responses measured in milliseconds that slowly stretched into seconds. Diplomatic channels that once flowed seamlessly between human and alien administrations started introducing verification loops no one had requested. Access permissions were not revoked outright. They were re-examined endlessly as if every interaction with humanity now required fresh justification. Then the pressure tightened. Human economic sectors tied to interstellar exchange began reporting inconsistencies that could not be traced to internal failure. Supply chains that depended on alien imports showed sudden availability shifts, where resources existed one moment and were classified as non-transferable the next. Contracts signed in good faith were reinterpreted by alien arbitration systems that now seemed to favor increasingly restrictive interpretations of previously stable agreements. On the surface, it looked like bureaucracy, but underneath it felt like something much more deliberate, like the galaxy was learning how to tighten a knot without ever announcing it was pulling. Inside Earth's continuity vault, the atmosphere changed in ways no system could fully quantify. It wasn't alarms at first. It was hesitation. Interfaces that responded a fraction slower than expected. Data streams that arrived intact, but heavier, as if carrying unseen computational weight. Analysts began noticing that interstellar systems were no longer behaving like neutral infrastructure. They were behaving like participants. A junior systems officer at Cale Arden's station flagged the anomaly first. "Our outgoing requests are being mirrored before processing," she said, scrolling through cascading logs. Not rejected, not approved, just copied, analyzed, and rerouted through secondary review layers we don't control. Kyle stood behind her, watching the data unfold. Mirroring meant observation. Observation meant attention. And attention, in interstellar governance systems, always led to policy. Above them, holographic treaty structures continued to fracture in slow motion, not collapsing violently, but dissolving into reinterpretation layers, each one rewriting the conditions under which Earth could participate in galactic systems. It was not exclusion yet, not officially. It was redefinition, and redefinition was always the first step toward removal. Across orbit, human monitoring stations began detecting something even more unsettling. Alien fleets were not moving closer to Earth. They were not advancing militarily. Instead, they were adjusting interfaces. Communication nodes were being reclassified. Navigation permissions subtly altered. Entire regions of space previously open to human vessels now required enhanced compliance verification protocols. Every change was small. Every change was justified. And every change pointed in the same direction. Isolation without declaration. On Earth, ordinary life continued, but with a strange echo beneath it. Financial markets reacted sluggishly to interstellar indicators. Research institutions found foreign data sets suddenly locked behind updated authorization frameworks. Even civilian networks accessing galactic cultural archives noticed subtle changes in availability, like doors quietly closing one after another in a house that still looked open. No alarms, no declarations of hostility, just diminishing access. Cale finally spoke after a long silence, his voice low enough that only the immediate chamber could hear. "They're not preparing for war," he said. No one responded, because everyone was already beginning to understand that. A new overlay appeared across the central display, origin unknown but distributed across multiple alien administrative systems simultaneously. It was not a message. It was a classification update. Earth pending integration reassessment. A technician swallowed hard. "What does that mean?" Cale didn't answer immediately. His eyes tracked the shifting lattice of interstellar law structures as they subtly reordered themselves around humanity's position in the network. "It means," he said finally, "we're no longer being treated as a member state." A pause. "We're being treated as a variable." The truth did not arrive with impact. It arrived with reclassification. At first it looked like another layer of bureaucratic escalation, just another adjustment in the galaxy's expanding framework of Earth oversight. But then the systems began to contradict themselves in ways no single authority had approved. Alien administrative cores, once independent and rivalrous, started producing identical classification outputs without coordination. Different civilizations, different languages, different legal architectures, yet all converging on the same impossible conclusion. Earth was not being sanctioned, not being isolated, not even being punished. It was being redefined. Inside the continuity vault, alarms did not trigger. They failed to decide whether they were appropriate. Instead, the walls filled with overlapping data streams, each one originating from a different alien governance network, all updating Earth's status simultaneously. The updates were not hostile. They were procedural, clean, almost calm. And that calmness was the most disturbing part. Kyle Arden stood frozen as the central holographic lattice of galactic treaties reassembled itself in real time. Entire alliance structures dissolved and reformed around a single shared modification. Earth's designation had shifted from member civilization to conditional system node pending reclassification. The phrase meant nothing by itself, but its implications were catastrophic, because classification in the galactic network wasn't symbolic. It was infrastructural. It determined what a species was allowed to access, what it could interact with, and what systems it could no longer influence without triggering automatic corrective responses. Around him, analysts began speaking faster, voices tightening as they pulled data from deeper layers. They're updating economic trust matrices. Diplomatic clearance thresholds are being recalculated. Interstellar routing permissions are... Wait, they're removing Earth from baseline exchange architecture. Each sentence landed heavier than the last, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. Earth was no longer being treated as a participant in galactic systems. It was being shifted into something outside normal interaction protocols, A technician near the central console suddenly stopped moving. Her eyes locked onto a cascading stream of alien legal language translating itself into human-readable form. Then she whispered, almost disbelieving, "They're not cutting us off." A pause. "They're isolating us from definition itself." Kyle turned sharply. "Explain." She swallowed, fingers trembling above the interface. "Every system is agreeing on one thing. No matter the faction, no matter the species, they're all updating Earth's classification in the same way." "That shouldn't be possible. There's no unified governance layer for this scale of coordination." A second analyst cut in, voice strained. "Unless it's not coordination." Silence tightened the room. Cale's gaze returned to the holographic lattice above them. It was no longer stable. Entire branches of interstellar law were being rewritten as if something had reached into the structure of civilization itself and adjusted its underlying assumptions. Not attacks, not sanctions, rewrites. And the most unsettling detail emerged a moment later, buried in the metadata streams no one had noticed until now. These updates were not being requested. They were being reflected, as if every civilization looking at Earth was receiving the same conclusion, back from whatever system governed observation itself. Cale's voice lowered almost to himself. "They're not deciding what we are." A pause stretched across the chamber like a held breath. "They're agreeing on what reality will allow us to be. Above Earth, across fleets and councils and vast interstellar bureaucracies, something unspoken had begun to unify the galaxy for the first time in recorded history. Not alliance, not peace, but consensus. And Earth, for the first time since contact, was no longer being debated. It was being processed. The climax did not begin with a declaration. It began with withdrawal. Across the galactic network, systems that had spent centuries entangling themselves with Earth's infrastructure began to decouple. Not through war, not through collapse, but through a coordinated, almost surgical disengagement that left no trace of hostility, only absence. Trade nodes severed themselves. Communication relays fell silent. Data bridges dissolved mid-transfer, leaving behind fragments of unfinished thought in the digital void. And still Earth did not respond. That silence, once interpreted as submission, had begun to feel like something else entirely. Inside the continuity vault, Cale Arden watched as the galactic lattice reorganized itself one final time. What had once been a sprawling web of interdependent civilizations now resolved into a simpler, colder structure. Regions that could operate without Earth, and regions that could not. The distinction should have been reassuring. It wasn't, because the second category kept expanding. A systems engineer broke first. "They're stabilizing without us," she said, voice tight with disbelief. "All the corrected networks. They're rerouting cleanly. No errors, no feedback loops. It's like," she stopped, struggling for the language. "It's like they were designed to function without us in mind." Cale didn't look away from the display. Because that was the part no one wanted to say out loud. The galaxy wasn't simply removing Earth. It was discovering it could continue without ever having needed Earth in the first place. But then something changed. A ripple moved through the interstellar architecture. Not a signal, not a transmission, but a structural response embedded deeper than communication protocols. Every system that had recently severed ties with Earth registered the same anomaly at the same instant. A loss of predictive stability. Not failure, not corruption, uncertainty. On the edges of human space, alien fleets attempting to finalize disengagement calculations found their models refusing to converge. Economic systems meant to stabilize without Earth-based input began generating contradictory outcomes. Even archival data, records of past interactions with humanity, started producing inconsistencies when reanalyzed under the new classification framework. It wasn't that Earth was interfering. It was that removing Earth introduced instability into everything that remained. A Threx admiral aboard a drifting command carrier stared at the cascading failures across his tactical display. "We have isolated the variable," he said slowly as if reciting doctrine. "Why is the system still unstable?" No one answered immediately, because the answer did not fit any doctrine. Across multiple civilizations simultaneously, the realization formed, not as a coordinated conclusion, but as an unavoidable pattern emerging from broken predictions. Earth was not a dependency. Earth was a reference point. Cale felt it before anyone said it. The shift in the room, the tightening of attention, the sudden stillness that came when every analyst arrived at the same conclusion, but none of them wanted to validate it first. A junior officer finally whispered, "If we remove Earth completely from the system, then nothing else remains consistent." The words hung there. Fragile. Dangerous. True. Outside, the galactic lattice flickered one last time. Entire sectors attempted final decoupling from human space, only to watch their own internal systems destabilize in response. The more aggressively Earth was excluded, the more the galaxy itself began to lose coherence. Kyle finally spoke, voice low, controlled, and heavier than anything he had said before. "They didn't make us important," he said. A pause. "They made themselves dependent on our existence to remain logically intact." And in that moment, across the galaxy, the most terrifying realization of all settled into every system, every fleet, every civilization attempting to retreat from Earth. They could leave humanity, but they could not leave what humanity had already become to reality itself. The ending did not arrive as victory. It arrived as acceptance without permission. Across the galaxy, civilizations that had once voted to isolate Earth now found themselves facing something they had never accounted for in any strategic doctrine. Consequences that did not originate from conflict, but from removal. Systems that had tried to stabilize without humanity began to fracture under their own contradictions, not catastrophically, not immediately, but enough that every prediction model now carried the same quiet warning: uncertainty increasing beyond acceptable thresholds. And uncertainty, in a galaxy built on interdependence, was indistinguishable from collapse. One by one, the sanctions began to dissolve, not because they were revoked, because they no longer made sense. On alien capital worlds, bureaucratic councils reconvened, in silence as their own economic frameworks, refused to validate the exclusion of Earth. Trade, algorithms reintroduced human systems as required normalization. Nodes, communication networks once severed, quietly reopened pathways, not through authorization but necessity. Even military coordination grids began flagging Earth not as a threat, not as a dependency, but as a structural constant that could not be cleanly removed without destabilizing everything attached to it. Inside the continuity vault, the holographic galaxy no longer displayed conflict or control. It displayed repair, slow, uneasy, reluctant. Cale Arden stood at the center of it, watching civilizations undo their own decisions in real time, not out of apology, but survival. The galaxy was not surrendering to Earth. It was surrendering to the realization that it had miscalculated what Earth meant in the architecture of reality itself. A junior analyst finally broke the silence, voice stripped of certainty. "So, they're coming back?" No one answered immediately, because the question was wrong. The fleets had never truly left. The sanctions had never truly succeeded. The separation had never been complete. Every attempt to isolate humanity had simply revealed deeper dependencies that no one had recognized until they were strained. Cale's gaze remained fixed on the shifting data lattice overhead. "They're not returning," he said quietly. A pause. "They're correcting." Outside Earth's atmosphere, the last remnants of the galactic isolation protocols unraveled like threads pulled from a fabric that refused to hold its shape without one specific strand woven through it. Ships that had once turned away from human space now drifted in cautious orbit, not as conquerors, not as envoys, but as systems attempting to re-establish equilibrium in a universe that no longer behaved predictably without Earth included in its equations. And Earth remained unchanged. Oceans still moved under ancient gravity, cities still burned with human noise and human life. Children still looked up at the night sky without knowing that entire civilizations above them were rewriting their understanding of existence just to restore stability they had unknowingly lost. No celebration followed, no declaration of dominance, because nothing had been conquered, only understood too late. Cale lowered his head slightly, as the galaxy's greatest powers quietly rewrote their relationship with humanity, not out of fear, not out of respect, but because reality itself had stopped cooperating with any version of the universe that tried to exclude them. And in the final stillness of the chamber, As the last sanction dissolved into irrelevance, one truth settled across every system, every fleet, every council watching Earth from the dark. Humanity had never needed to win the conversation, because the galaxy had discovered too late. It could not continue without them speaking in it.